Alright guys, so we are continuing just where we left off, right? So now we are at task 3. That means that we should have covered all of this, meaning that on your spreadsheet you should have all of this. You're supposed to have attendance 1, looking at this, with the 30 names of course. Remember, I only have about 10 names here. You need to have the full 30. Attendance 2, supposed to look at this with a heading like that, filling in the rest of the information with your symptoms and your ICU. So the main changes that took place in this section was the information that is there and the heading that we have up there. Those are the main things that took place in task 2. Alright, so once you're past that, we are on now to task 3. So we're moving through, so we'll finish. Alright, so task 3 says now, copy the data from attendance 2 to a new sheet called attendance complete 3. Means that you're going to block everything that you have on attendance 2 sheet and copy it to attendance complete 3. Right? Shouldn't be too easy. Alright, so that is A. For B, which is asking us to sort, we're going to come back to this one. We're going to come back to that one for now. We're going to do it, but we're going to come back to it. Alright? In addition, we're going to come back to this too. So these two, B and E, we're going to come back to last. I will talk about those last. So for now, we're just going to focus on A, C, and D. Alright? So for C, it says, create a key to store the data for each patient's expense. 3 of the expenses, and they're giving the sheet is not giving you 3 of the expenses. So one of the expenses bed, one is meal, and the other is medication. So creating a key sheet for the bed, the meal, and the medication. The key is going to be a section on the bottom that stores figures that don't change. Alright, figures that you have that are constant, that never change, like a GCT, or in this case we have some expenses. These are single figures that will never change, so we don't need to keep duplicating them throughout the spreadsheet. We can put them in a key sheet. Every time we want that information, we can refer to it. Alright, so that's why we're creating a key sheet, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Continuing C, it says you will determine an additional 4th expense. You will determine that 4th expense, right? That the patient will have. So we have given you the bed, the meal, and the medication. So your responsibility now to think about it. In a hospital environment, what is the 4th expense that you think that these patients might be charged by the hospital? Alright, apart from the bed and the meal and the medication, think of a 4th expense. In my situation, you're going to see me use one for my example, right? So you're not going to use the one that I use. You're going to think of one unique to yourself on your own that makes sense. It has to be something that makes sense. Right? You can't come up with no foolishness, so you know say won't be applicable in a hospital environment or whatever the case is. That makes sense. Alright? Now we continue further to explain about the expenses. The expenses will vary between patients in isolation and intensive care. Remember, we have some patients that are in isolation and intensive care. So what this is saying is that patients in isolation will pay a different figure from the patients in intensive care, which makes sense because isolation does mean that you're in there, you're surviving, trying to get better. Intensive care means that you have more machinery, more staff, whatever, looking after you. So person in intensive care would naturally pay more. Alright? Beds in isolation will pay 5,000. I hear they're giving you some figures that would go in the key. Beds in isolation will pay 5,000. Meals will be 2,500. And medication will be 3,500. So for beds per day, 5,000. Meals will be 2,500 and medication will be $3,000 per day. Bear in mind these are fictitious figures, might not be necessarily the same in a real life environment, but we're trying to keep it something that makes sense, because this could actually make sense. The additional expenses should not be lower than 1,500 and should not exceed 7,500. So the additional expense that I spoke about, that I told you that you're going to have to make up, it should not be lower than 1,500 and it should not exceed 7,500. So the figure that you are going to make up whatever these new expenses, it must fall in the range between $1,500 and $7,500. All right. Expenses for intensive care patients will be 55% higher. Let me specify that properly. Let me clear some of that. Expenses for intensive care patients is going to be 55% higher than isolation patients, meaning that all of the figures that you got here are for isolation patients. Right? All of these figures are isolation patients, persons in isolation. Intensive care patients will pay 55% more than the isolation figures. If you notice, the sheet didn't give you these intensive care figures. It also that is 55% more. So like when they give you the isolation figures, it means that you will have to put in a formula to pay 55% more, to increase the isolation figures by 55% to make them intensive care figures. All right, you're going to see what we're talking about in a second. Next says D, insert an expenses area for each patient. Meaning that each patient must have an expenses area for the 4 expenses that they're going to have, and use the data from the expenses section of the key to determine these figures. From the data and the key, in insert. So we're going to use a key to insert the data into the spreadsheet for each patient. All right. So let's examine our sheet so we know exactly what we're talking about here. So after you have completed this sheet right here, this is your sheet 2, class 2, and you copy everything, go across, you will have something that looks like that with just this section only, right? With a heading, right? So I have gone ahead and I have expanded my sheet now, and I have included the 4 expenses that we spoke about earlier. See them? So these are the expenses: bed, meal, medication, and in my case, for my 4th expense, I am calling my 4th expense equipment. Right? Any form of medical equipment that they use, whether it be syringe, needle, anything like that. Alright, so that is my 4th expense. So for the key section now that I was talking to you about, so for your one now, you're going to make up a 4th expense. This one, make up something for that one. Not going to be equipment, but you have to get a different name. That makes sense. That is applicable in a hospital environment. Good. Take a moment, make sure you're absorbing all of this. Let's move on. Now for the key that I was explaining to you a while ago, there are a number of things here, but I'm focusing right now. I want to focus on this part of the key. Alright, that is the part of the key that interests me right now. Right? So the sheet before that I was just reading, it gave you this set of information. The isolation figures for meal, bed, meal, and medication. I made up this 4th one for equipment. Right? Good. And if you notice the figure that I have here for equipment as a document express, it should be between $1,500 and $7,000. So mine falls right in that range right there. So, all right. Now for the figures for intensive care, the sheet didn't give you these figures. The sheet does tell you that these figures, sorry, should be 55% more than the isolation figures. 55% more. All right. So for that, it means that for the intensive care here, so we have to put in some sort of formula to calculate this. So in my case, I use this formula, right? Where I said B19. So if I'm doing the bed, for isolation, the bed was given at 7,000. So that will be B19 times 155% will give you the intensive care figure. So when you're doing this, put your cursor in the intensive care part right here, so which will be blank. So your one will be blank. And you type in The isolation figure for bed, which in my case is B19. Your one might be further down on the sheet. Your might be B30 something or something like that. In my case, it's B19 times 155%. And 155% means that it's increasing. So what this means is that the $7,000 here so has increased by 55% to now make it 10,850. That's basically what this is saying. So it started off as $7,000, and the $7,000 has now increased by 55%, making it $10,850. Right? So when you do your one, make sure that you're getting close to this, because you have to understand the maths in this to make sure that you're on the right track. You don't want to do something and see a figure come up and you just assume say it right. It must be the correct thing, right? So let me tell you, you're going to have an idea if this is correct now. If you have $7,000, oh wow, what terrible writing is this? $7,000. That's what you have, and you need to find 55% of the $7,000. Right? 55% of $7,000 is going to be, let me do that math in my head quick, that is going to be 3,850. 3,850. Right? So when you add the 7,000 to the 3,850, that is how you'll get that figure. Right? So I've just given you a simple figure. So instead of finding 55% of this and then adding it to the original amount or whatever the case is, I've given you a simple formula. Let's use this formula right here. So the original amount, which is in B19 in my case, which is the $7,000 times 155%, that will automatically increase that $7,000 by 55%. Alright? And the same thing goes for all of them. So for each of them, you just do the same thing. For each cell going down, 155% of that, 155% of that, 155% of that, right? And you should have your complete key section for this section, right? So once you have completed this section, we're doing it in stages, so when I rush the thing, complete this stage section here. So make sure they have this part full and proper, and then we can move forward, all right? At any point, feel free to pause and bring back a slide and make sure that you can watch it again and look it over, make sure you understand what it is saying. Alright, so from this point forward, once we have that key section in place, we can go up here so we can start putting in some figures. So I have gone ahead and I have put in some figures here. I put in all of these figures, these formulas already. Right, the formulas for this section to show you that this is how it is going to come out. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what is the formula exactly that I put into each of these cells here, so in order to get the figure. Alright, so the formula that you'll be using is the same one that I'll be using. Bear in mind, where you have your cells placed might be different from where I have my cells placed. Alright, so if I have my bed starting column K right here, so I have my bed starting column K here, so you might have your bed in a different part going more down on the sheet or whatever the case is. Just remember, so if I say bed, I am referring to wherever on your sheet you have this cell or whichever one you're working with. Alright? Alright, so let's try and see what we have here. So in this cell right here, so now we're going to be using what's called an if statement. Alright? Alright, good. So as we move forward now, bear in mind, the figures that I have here for the expenses are per day. Per day. Mean that for isolation for bed, if it's $7,000 per day, bear in mind the figures I have for my isolation here so might be different. That is what's on the sheet. So you have to follow the figures that are on the sheet. Alright, just letting you know. But these figures are per day. Mean that if it's in isolation for bed, it's $7,000 per day. Right? That means that whatever figure you get, you need to multiply it by the amount of days that the person will be in the hospital for. So if it's Barrett, and Barrett will be in the hospital for 15 days, whatever figure you get must times 15, right? If it's Nicola Brown in an hospital for 20 days, then it means that whatever figure you get must times 20 days, right? That will give you the overall figure that the person is to pay. If you're doing times the days, it's only going to give you the daily figure, right? So bear that in mind. So here we go. So I'm going to put in the figure now for bent, right? So you see my cursor is now, I have now clicked the cell right here. So what I'm going to type is going to come up in the address bar over here. So, all right. So I am saying I'm going to use what's called an if statement, all right? An if statement, because what I want to do is I want to say if what is in this cell is equal to, hold on, let me fix that properly so you can see. I want to say what is in this cell is equal to this, then I'm going to use these figures. Or if it's equal to this, then I want to use these figures. So that is what the if statement is going to say. The if statement is going to say if this cell, because I'm going to be using this person here, so bent, if that cell, which is J8, so whatever is in J8 is equal to isolation, then I can use these. If it's equal to intensive care, then I will use these figures here. So, right? So let's try that and see how it works now. So we are saying equal if open bracket if J8, because that is where my ICU intensive care figures are. J8 is equal to, from bed, and we're working this for bed because we are in the K column for bed. So if J8 equal to isolation then, so it's a comma is then the isolation bed figures times the number of days. Otherwise, so we say otherwise again using a comma, otherwise is going to be the intensive care figures times the number of days, right? So it is saying that if we're having J8 is equal to isolation, then they use the isolation figures. If it's intensive care, then they use intensive care figures. That's basically what it's saying. Then you just close a bracket. When you press enter or you press the ticket, your top right, your answer should come in. So this is now telling me that this patient will have to pay $151,900 to stay for 14 days because they are in intensive care. All right. I am going to do another one so you get this properly. Let's do for Nicola Brown. All right. Same procedure. Watch me. So we're saying equal if open bracket, and then we're using, in this case, because we're using Nicole Brown, which is in row 10. So now we're saying if open bracket J10, so if J10 is equal to, oh, some change right now. So sorry, let me carry this quick. If J10 is equal to isolation, then the P the bed, the isolation figure for the bed, times the amount of days that the person is staying. Otherwise, and you said otherwise with the next comma, otherwise they will pay the intensive care figures times the amount of days. And you close bracket, and that will give you the bed figures for Nicola Brown. So as I press enter, I press the green ticket in the top right. Because I'm using an Android device, if you're using a computer, I can just press enter, or a laptop or a PC. Right, so that is the figure that I get. Alright, I'm going to show you some more examples. So let's look at meals. If we're doing meals for the same Nicola Brown. Right? Ready? Let me just scroll up on my screen. So hopefully you can see everything one time. So I'm doing meals for Nicola Brown. Good. Use from the meal to the meal heading. Alright. So I want to say equal if open bracket if J10, because that's still what is controlling our if statement, if J10 is equal to, so we're doing meals, alright, J10 equal to isolation, then you use a meal from isolation times the number of days. Otherwise, now we said comma, otherwise it's going to be the intensive care figures times the number of days. You close brackets with that and enter. Right? So this is what we'll do, just going across. As you do this more and more, you will get the pattern, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about. Alright, so you're not going to get it just one off. You have to do a couple of them and start to the pattern, and hopefully you start to the rationale behind it. Let's do medication for same Nicole Brown. Alright, so we'll move that a little bit faster. So we'll say equal if open bracket if the ICU/ISO figures equal to isolation, then the medication times number of days. Otherwise, it's going to be the intensive care medication times the number of days. Close bracket, and that should give you the figures for that person. Alright? Let me do the final one for Nicole Brown, which is the equipment. So again, for equipment, equal if open bracket if J10 equal to isolation, then use the isolation figures. What next? Times what? Times the number of days. Good. Otherwise, we use the the what? The intensive care figures for equipment times the number of days. Alright, close the brackets, enter, and there you have it. Right? So you just continue this process. So if I were going to do it for Rachel Brown, which is in row 11 here, so for this person here, so if I were going to do it for that person, I'd be using, these are the fields that I'll be using, the isolation and the number of days. So we're using the figures for this column, the data that is in that column, right? And then we're comparing it with what is down here, so for each one of these columns. So if I do it in order, it would say, I would say if this column is equal to this, if I'm doing bed for Rachel Brown, alright, if I'm doing bed, let me start again. If I'm doing this bed here, so for Rachel Brown, I would say if J11 equal to that, then that times the number of days. Otherwise, it's the bed figure for intensive care times the number of days. That's basically what we're doing. And we're repeating that over and over to capture all of the equipment figures for all 30 persons. Alright? Might take a little while, but as I said, once you get into the pattern and you start moving through it, you should get through it quite quickly. There's a shorter way to do this, a much shorter way. I'm not going to show you, but I can tell you that it involves something called absolute cell referencing. So if you can go through your textbook or Google and find out how to do absolute cell referencing, you can get this done in a fraction of the time. So if you take an hour for typing these formulas, you can finish this within 5 or less minutes. If you can learn how to use the absolute cell referencing. I don't want to tell you how to use it at this time personally, because I feel like repeating the same thing over and over will give you practice and will make it stick in your head. So you typing out this for all 30 people for each type of equipment, each type of expense will give you necessary practice over and over to make sure that it's sticking in your head. If I show you a shortcut, you're just going to jump straight to the shortcut and you might not learn everything that you should learn, that you would have learned from repeating it. Alright? So I just want to do it this way for now. At a point further down, when it comes to marking, I will tell you how to fix that quick, and you can just get those marks and it won't be a problem. Alright? So for your case now, you're going to do this for 30 people. As I say right now, I only have about 6 people in my list. You're going to do this for all 30 persons. Alright, so when you finish this, at the bottom of your sheet right here, so you're just going to do an equal sum. Equal sum for everything going down for each column. Alright, and we know what equal sum work already, right? So in my case, for example, if I am adding the bed, in my case, in K12, I would say equal sum K6 to K11, and that will add up everything that I receive going all the way down. So I'm going to show you what I have. So in here, so this is what I typed. Let me write that better. This is what I typed right here, so right, equal sum K6 to K11, and that will sum everything going down. Right, so you will do the same thing for this one, same thing for this one, same thing for this. So at the bottom here, so you always have a running total of all your expenses, right? And then that will use further down when ready to create a chart. So that part is absolutely necessary. All right, take a moment, pause, look at it, make sure you get it. All of what we just did a while ago was from it closed. I'm gonna open it back. Was from task 3. Alright? So we did A, C, and D. Alright? So at this point, just look it over, make sure that you have everything finished. So when you finish, your sheet should end right here. So with R30 going down, all right, and you shouldn't have a problem. So let me just stop this video right here so that you can work through that, and then I will pick up task 4 in another video. All right.